Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Green River Killer. To understand this story, we must first travel back to the summer of 1982, to a place where the air is thick with the scent of pine and the persistent, heavy dampness of the Pacific Northwest. Imagine a landscape painted in shades of deep moss and charcoal gray, where the clouds often hang low, snagging on the jagged tops of ancient cedar trees. This is a land of giants, of mountains that watch in silence and rivers that carve their way through the earth with a slow, relentless patience. We are in the Kent Valley, just south of Seattle, a place where the urban sprawl begins to fray at the edges, giving way to industrial parks, sleepy berry farms, and the tangled, green veins of the riverbanks. The atmosphere here is unique. It is a mixture of progress and primordial wilderness. In July, the heat can feel heavy, pressing down on the valley floor, trapped between the Cascades to the east and the Olympic Mountains to the west. It is a time for long afternoons, for the hum of insects in the tall grass, and for the rhythmic, soothing flow of the water. But in 1982, that peace was about to be shattered by a secret that had been hidden just beneath the surface of the Green River. The Green River itself is a winding ribbon of history. It begins high in the Cascade Range, born from the melting snows and the steady rains that define this corner of the world. By the time it reaches the Valley of Kent, it has slowed, its waters a murky, opaque jade, the color that gave the river its name. It is not a clear river, but one filled with the stories of the land, the silt of the mountains, the debris of fallen trees, and the quiet secrets of the deep. Along its banks, the vegetation grows with a frantic, emerald energy. Thick clusters of blackberry brambles, their thorns sharp and reaching, tangle with the broad leaves of maple trees and the delicate, feathered fronds of ferns. The mud along the shore is soft and dark, holding the imprints of everything that passes by, the paws of a wandering raccoon, the heavy boots of a fisherman, and on one particular day, the evidence of something far more sinister. The river has a sound of its own, a low, constant murmur, like 1,000 voices whispering at once, drowned out only by the occasional cry of a hawk circling high above in the hazy blue sky. It is a place that feels both beautiful and lonely, a sanctuary that can quickly turn into a graveyard when the sun begins to set and the shadows stretch long across the water. It was July 15, 1982, a Thursday. The temperature in the valley was climbing, reaching toward the high 80s. In the town of Kent, the air felt stationary, as if the entire world were holding its breath. It was the kind of day where the pavement shimmers with heat, and the only relief can be found in the shade of the river trees. For two teenage boys, it was a day for adventure. They were out on their bicycles, the metal frames glinting in the harsh summer sun. Think of the sound of those tires, the rhythmic crunch of rubber over loose gravel and the metallic click-clack of the chains as they pedaled toward the Peck Bridge. They were young, perhaps 16 or 17, moving through the world with the unburdened curiosity of youth. They weren't looking for tragedy. They were likely looking for a place to cool off, a spot where they could skip stones or perhaps catch a glimpse of the salmon that occasionally struggled against the current. The bridge loomed ahead, a structure of steel and concrete that spanned the moving water, providing a brief moment of shade for anyone passing underneath. As they approached the bank, the boys left their bikes leaning against a tree, the wheels still spinning slowly in the warm air, and made their way down to the water's edge. The descent to the river was steep, the path worn smooth by years of footsteps. The boys moved carefully, their sneakers slipping slightly on the dry, dusty earth. As they reached the shoreline, the smell of the river became more intense, the scent of wet stone, decaying vegetation, and the faint, metallic tang of the water. It was then that one of them noticed something unusual near the bridge supports. At first, it might have looked like a piece of debris, a discarded mannequin, or perhaps a log that had become tangled in the brush. But as they drew closer, the the reality of the scene began to crystallize in the afternoon light. There, partially submerged in the shallow, slow-moving water, was the body of a young woman. She lay among the river stones and the tangled roots, her form unnervingly still against the gentle movement of the current. The boys stopped, the silence of the river suddenly feeling heavy and suffocating. The world seemed to contract, the heat of the sun forgotten as a cold wave of realization washed over them. This was not a discarded object. This was a person. She was clothed, but there was a devastating disorder to her appearance. The boys didn't stay long. The primal instinct to run took hold. They scrambled back up the bank, their breath coming in short, ragged gasps, and raced toward the nearest phone to call for help, leaving the river to guard its first terrible secret for just a few moments longer. The woman in the water was 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield. To the world, she would soon become a headline, a data point in a growing tragedy, but to those who knew her, she was a girl with a life full of complicated turns. Wendy had been born in Renton, just a short distance from where she was found. She was a teenager who had faced more than her share of shadows. She had been living in a foster home in Tacoma, a young woman trying to find her footing in a world that often felt unstable. She was known to be a runaway, someone who moved through the fringes of society, perhaps searching for a sense of belonging that remained just out of reach. On July 8, 1982, she had walked away from her mother's home, telling her she was going for a walk. It was a simple, mundane act, a walk on a summer evening, but it was the last time she would be seen alive. When the investigators arrived at the Green River that afternoon, they found that Wendy had been strangled, her own clothing used as a weapon against her. There was a cold, calculated brutality to the act, a sense that whoever had done this had no regard for the life they had extinguished. Wendy was the first, the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt the Pacific Northwest for decades to come. She was a daughter, a teenager, a girl who should have had years of summer afternoons ahead of her, now silenced by the very river that should have been her sanctuary. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long, orange fingers across the Kent Valley, the area around Peck Bridge transformed. The quiet murmur of the river was replaced by the low thrum of police engines and the crackle of two-way radios. Yellow crime scene tape was stretched between the maple trees, fluttering slightly in the evening breeze. Detectives moved with somber precision, their shadows lengthening on the mud as they documented every detail of the scene. They looked at the way the body had been placed, the way the current had moved around it, and the lack of struggle in the immediate area. It was clear that Wendy had not died here. The river was merely the place where her life had been discarded. The air, once so warm and inviting, now felt chilled. In the surrounding neighborhoods, people began to lock their doors, a subtle shift in the atmosphere taking place as news of the discovery spread. It was a loss of innocence for the valley. For years, the Green River had been a place of recreation, of family picnics and childhood explorations. Now, it was a crime scene. As the investigators worked into the night, their flashlights cutting through the gathering gloom, they had no way of knowing that Wendy Caulfield was only the start. They didn't know that the man responsible was already moving back into the shadows, blending into the everyday life of the suburbs, waiting for the next opportunity to return to the water. The first secret of the river had been revealed, but many more were waiting in the dark. As the calendar turned from 1982 to 1983, a subtle and terrifying shift occurred in the geography of the horror. The damp, silt-heavy banks of the Green River, once the primary stage for these discoveries, were no longer the only places where the silence was broken by the sirens of recovery teams. The killer had begun to move into the shadowed, secondary spaces of the county. The wooded lots near the SeaTac Airport and the neglected strips of land beneath the roaring flight paths. Imagine the scene in the sweltering heat of July in 1983. The air is thick with the smell of jet fuel and dry grass, and the constant, rhythmic thunder of descending planes vibrates through the very earth beneath your feet. It was here, in a patch of scrub and tangled blackberry vines, that the remains of young women like Giselle Lovevorn were discovered. The pattern was changing, becoming more chaotic and expansive. The investigators realized with a sinking dread that they were no longer just patrolling a single riverbank. They were searching a vast, urban wilderness where the mud of the previous year's rains had hardened into a crust of secrets, hiding the evidence of a predator who was growing bolder with every passing month. Throughout the middle of 1983, the Pacific Highway South, known locally as the Strip, became a corridor of mounting and suffocating anxiety. Every flickering neon sign of the roadside motels and every darkened parking lot seemed to hold a potential witness or a potential victim. The names began to pile up in the precinct files like fallen leaves in a storm. Marie Malvar in April, Carol Christensen in May, and Yvonne Antosh just a few weeks later. The escalation was relentless, a steady drumbeat of disappearances that left the local community paralyzed. The investigators felt as though they were chasing a phantom that could vanish into the heavy Pacific Northwest, missed at a moment's notice. They looked for commonalities, the type of spray paint found on some victims, or the specific way the remains were positioned. But the killer seemed to be playing a game of constant adaptation. He was a creature of the gray Pacific light, moving through the rain-slicked streets of SeaTac and Des Moines with a familiarity that suggested he was not an outsider, but a part of the very landscape he was marring. The mud on his boots was the same mud found in the gardens of the suburbs, a detail that made the threat feel impossibly close and personal. By the time January of 1984 arrived, the pressure on the King County Police Department had reached a fever pitch. The public's fear had transformed into a demanding roar for action, leading to the official formation of the second and much larger Green River Task Force. Picture the cramped, makeshift headquarters they were assigned, a space where the air was always stagnant and the scent of bitter, burnt coffee hung like a permanent fog. Captain Frank Adamson and detectives like Dave Reichert stood before massive topographic maps that spanned entire walls, their surfaces becoming a mosaic of colored pins and handwritten notes. A budget of $2 million was allocated, a staggering sum for the time, yet it felt insufficient against the overwhelming scale of the task. They were no longer a small team of investigators. They were an army of 43 officers trying to find one man in a county of over 1 million people. The room was a hive of frantic energy, lit by the harsh, humming glow of fluorescent tubes that made everyone's skin look as sallow as the paper they were processing. Each morning, they stared at the maps, watching as the clusters of pins grew denser around the airport and the southern highways, a pattern in the dirt that refused to reveal its author. The logistical mountain the task force faced was almost insurmountable. In 1984, the digital age was still a distant horizon, and the tools at their disposal were painfully primitive. Every tip, every sighting of a suspicious vehicle, and every interview had to be meticulously recorded on paper forms and filed in heavy, slate-gray steel cabinets. They struggled with a rudimentary computer system that could only process a fraction of the data, leaving the detectives to perform the grueling work of manual cross-referencing for hours on end. There were tens of thousands of leads to pursue. They had boxes filled with the names of truck owners, frequenters of the Strip, and men with prior arrests, yet the common thread remained invisible. The physical toll on the men and women of the task force was visible in their hunched shoulders and the dark circles beneath their eyes. They would spend 12 hours a day sifting through the minutiae of lives cut short, only to return home and find themselves unable to sleep, their minds still tracing the lines of the Highway 99 corridor in the dark. The silence of their homes was often interrupted by the mental replay of witness statements, searching for the one voice they might have missed in the cacophony of the investigation. As the spring of 1984 progressed, The discovery of remains began to occur with a terrifying and sickening frequency. Sometimes as many as 2 victims were being recovered in a single week. The wooded areas around Star Lake and the Mountain View Cemetery became sites of recurring sorrow, marked by the yellow tape of crime scenes that seemed never to be removed. The name Green River had become a brand of terror, a shadow that stretched across the entire region and touched every household. Law enforcement felt the crushing weight of the ticking clock. They knew that for every day they spent lost in the labyrinth of their own filing systems, the killer was likely out there, watching the very same news reports they were. The pattern in the mud was no longer just a forensic detail. It was a map of their own frustration and a testament to the killer's invisibility. The safe, suburban veneer of the Kent Valley had been stripped away, revealing a dark undercurrent that seemed as deep and cold as the river itself. They were caught in a race against a predator who had turned their own backyards into a hunting ground. And as the rain began to fall once more in the late spring, the earth seemed ready to swallow even more of their hope, leaving them to search for a phantom in the endless, gray drizzle of the Northwest. The relentless rain of the Pacific Northwest seemed to have seeped into the very marrow of the investigation by 1984. Detectives Dave Reichert and Robert Keppel found themselves standing in a landscape of mounting paperwork and dwindling hope, the damp air of King County, thick with the weight of unsolved tragedies. It was during this period of suffocating stillness that a letter arrived from 3,000 miles away, originating from the sun-scorched, sterile corridors of Florida State Prison. The envelope was unremarkable, yet the name on the return address sent a familiar, icy shiver through the precinct. Theodore Robert Bundy. The man who had once terrorized the same evergreen forests was now reaching out from death row, offering a window into a mind he claimed to understand better than any lawman ever could. He did not ask for leniency, nor did he offer a traditional confession. Instead, he proposed a collaboration, a descent into the psychological abyss to hunt the ghost that was now haunting the Green River. The detectives, exhausted by the mounting tally of the lost, realized they were about to ask a monster to help them catch a shadow. The transition from the cool, pine-scented mist of Washington to the oppressive, humid heat of Florida was jarring. As Keppel and Reichert approached the heavy gates of Ryford, the air felt thick and salty, vibrating with the constant, low-frequency hum of industrial air conditioning and the distant, rhythmic clanging of steel on steel. Every footstep echoed against the polished linoleum floors of the prison, a sound that felt hollow and metallic in the absolute silence of the high-security wing. The smell was a clinical mixture of floor wax, old coffee, and the faint, unmistakable scent of fear that permeates such places. They were ushered through a series of heavy motorized doors that slid open with a sharp hiss and closed with a final, heavy thud, sealing them inside with the man they had once worked so hard to put away. In the interview room, the light was harsh and unforgiving, casting long, stark shadows across the table. When the door opened and Bundy was led in, he did not look like the charismatic predator the media had painted. He looked thinner, his hair beginning to recede, yet his eyes remained as sharp and piercing as a shard of glass in the moonlight. The air in the small room became still as Bundy took his seat, the chains of his shackles rattling with a soft, melodic clink that seemed to emphasize the gravity of the encounter. He spoke with a measured, soft-spoken precision, his voice a smooth contrast to the jagged nature of the subject matter. He did not call the killer by his media-given title. Instead, he coined a new name, one that felt more personal and intimate, the Riverman. As he spoke, he leaned forward, his hands resting on the table, occasionally gesturing with a fluidity that suggested he was back in his element, analyzing a puzzle he felt uniquely qualified to solve. He spoke of the killer as if he were an old friend or perhaps a younger, less experienced version of himself. He described the psychological river the killer navigated, not just the physical one. He explained how the perpetrator likely felt a sense of divine control as he moved through the woods, how each site was a sanctuary where time stood still, and how the absence of remorse was not a void, but a quiet, humming presence in the killer's daily life. Bundy's most chilling insight was offered with a calm, almost academic detachment. He suggested that the investigators were looking at the disposal sites incorrectly. To the police, they were scenes of horror and evidence. To the killer, they were places of pilgrimage. Bundy theorized that the riverman would return to these secluded groves time and time again, long after the life had been extinguished, to commune with what he had left behind. He described a compulsive need for the killer to revisit the remains, to touch them, to move them, and to relive the moment of total domination. He advised the detectives to find a fresh site, a place where a victim had only recently been placed, and to wait in the absolute darkness. He told them to watch not for a man fleeing, but for a man returning home. The idea that the killer was still out there, possibly standing just feet away from the search teams in the dead of night, sent a wave of nausea through the investigators, even as they scribbled down every word of this dark, unsolicited advice. For hours, they sat in that small, airless room, listening to a predator dissect a peer. Bundy's eyes would often glaze over as he lost himself in the hypothetical details, his speech slowing as he visualized the act of the hunt. He described the specific type of person, the killer targeted, vulnerable, overlooked, and existing on the fringes of society, noting that the killer viewed them not as humans, but as objects to be collected and curated. The detectives felt a deep, gnawing discomfort, realizing that the man sitting across from them was enjoying the process. He was relishing the opportunity to exert power over the investigation from behind bars, showing off his intellectual prowess while subtly reminding them of his own horrific legacy. Every piece of advice was a double-edged sword, a genuine insight into the mind of a serial killer, wrapped in the arrogant vanity of a man who believed he was the architect of the very shadows they were trying to illuminate. As the interview concluded and the guards led Bundy back to his cell, the silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Capel and Reichert walked out into the fading Florida sun, the heat now feeling like a physical weight on their shoulders. They carried with them 22 pages of notes, a roadmap of a psyche that defied any normal human understanding. On the flight back to the damp forests of Washington, they looked out over the clouds, reflecting on the terrible necessity of their trip. They had gone to the devil to learn how to catch a demon. The profile Bundy had provided was terrifyingly accurate in its depiction of the killer's need for control and his ritualistic return to the scenes of his crimes. While the advice to stake out the sites would prove difficult to execute without the media's interference, the psychological seeds had been planted. They now knew that their target was not just a murderer, but a man who lived in a state of constant, quiet obsession, a neighbor who walked among them with the secrets of the river tucked neatly behind a mask of ordinary existence. The 1980s bled into the 1990s with a quiet, agonizing whimper. The once frenetic energy of the task force headquarters began to dissipate, replaced by a heavy, dust-settled stillness. Where there had once been dozens of detectives, now only a handful remained, their desks standing like lonely islands in a sea of empty, gray linoleum. The sound of the telephone, which once rang with the frantic rhythm of a desperate heartbeat, became a rare and startling intrusion. Each ring was a false hope, a ghost on the line. The walls of the office were still plastered with the faces of the missing, but the ink was beginning to fade under the relentless, flickering hum of the fluorescent lights. The detectives who remained moved with a slow, weary grace, their shoulders hunched under the weight of thousands of pages of interviews that led to nothing but dead ends. They were the curators of a tragedy that the world seemed to be forgetting. The budget cuts had come like a slow-acting poison, thinning the ranks until the hunt for the Green River Killer was no longer a war, but a lonely vigil kept by a dedicated, exhausted few. Outside the office walls, the Pacific Northwest continued its rhythmic, melancholic cycle of mist and rain. The moss grew thicker over the stones near the riverbanks, and the narrow logging roads where victims had been found were slowly reclaimed by the ferns and the towering Douglas firs. For Dave Reichert and the skeleton crew of investigators, the 1990s were a decade of haunting echoes. They walked through the hallways of the King County Sheriff's Office, passing by rooms that used to be filled with the thick smoke of cigarettes and the frantic tapping of typewriters. Now those rooms were used for storage, filled with boxes of evidence that smelled of old cardboard, cold plastic, and time. The case had not been solved. It had simply gone dormant, like a predator blending into the deep undergrowth. Every time a new set of remains was unearthed by a hiker or a construction crew, the old wounds would reopen, but the leads remained as thin as the winter sunlight. They were waiting for a miracle of science, though they did not yet know what form that miracle would take. While the law was forced into a state of suspended animation, Gary Ridgway lived a life of profound, terrifying normalcy. Throughout the 1990s, he was a permanent fixture at the Kenworth truck plant in Renton. The air inside the factory was thick and heavy, a constant swirl of industrial chemicals, metallic dust, and the sharp, stinging scent of spray paint. Gary moved through this sensory overload with the practiced ease of a ghost. He was the man behind the respirator, his hands often stained with the pigments of a dozen different shades of primer. He was reliable. He was punctual. He was unremarkable. His coworkers saw a man who kept to himself, a man who did not smoke or drink, and who seemed entirely devoid of the shadows that define a monster. When he finished his shift, he would peel off his stiff work clothes and return to his modest home in Auburn, where his third wife, Judith, waited for him. To her, he was the perfect husband. He was the man who brought her flowers for no reason, who helped with the household chores, and who spoke to her with a softness that masked the internal rot. Their life together was a carefully woven tapestry of the mundane. They went on camping trips into the deep woods, they rode bicycles through the local parks, and they shared the quiet intimacy of a couple growing old in the shadow of the mountains. Judith saw a man who was devoted to his son, a man who attended church services on Sunday mornings and smiled politely at the neighbors over the garden fence. She had no way of knowing that the man sleeping beside her had spent his years prowling the Pacific Highway, or that the silence he maintained during their long evenings was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a hidden history. The irony was suffocating. While the task force agonized over his identity, Gary was painting trucks and tending to his lawn, a predator hiding in the most brightly lit corner of society. He had mastered the art of being invisible by being exactly like everyone else. The monster was not hiding under the bed. He was the one tucking the world in and turning out the lights. Deep within the climate-controlled vaults of the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab, the keys to Gary's cell were already in the possession of the state. They were contained in small glass vials and plastic bags. A few strands of hair, a dried sample of saliva, and biological evidence collected from the victims years earlier in 1987. But in the mid-1990s, these samples were silent. The technology of the time, the science of forensic DNA, was like a map written in a language no one could yet read. The detectives knew the evidence was there, but they were trapped in a technological bottleneck. They had to wait for the world to catch up to the scale of the crimes. Year after year, the samples sat in the dark, held in a state of icy preservation. Time was the enemy of the human investigation, but it was the silent ally of the science. The decade of waiting was not a void, but a long, slow bridge toward a truth that was finally beginning to crystallize in the microscopic world of the double helix. As the 1990s drew toward a close, the sense of stagnation began to shift. The world was changing. The internet was beginning to connect distant pieces of information, and forensic labs were whispering about new methods of amplification that could turn a tiny, invisible speck of skin or fluid into a definitive genetic signature. The few detectives who remained on the task force felt a renewed sense of urgency, a tightening in their chests, as they realized the clock was finally ticking for the man who had eluded them for nearly 20 years. They returned to the files with fresh eyes and a desperate hope, looking at the name Gary Ridgway, a name that had been on their list since 1982. They wondered if the unremarkable truck painter with the gentle smile was indeed the ghost they had been chasing through the Pacific Northwest fog. The silence of the decade was about to be shattered, and the long, cold wait was finally coming to an end. The river was giving up its secrets, and the science was finally ready to speak. Inside the quiet, climate-controlled rooms of the King County Sheriff's Office, the air always felt heavy with the scent of old paper and the faint, metallic tang of filing cabinets. By the time the year 2000 arrived, the bustling hallways of the original task force had grown silent. Most of the investigators had moved on to other cases or retired to quiet lives away from the shadows of the river. But one man remained. Detective Tom Jensen sat amidst the towering stacks of boxes, a solitary figure surrounded by the physical remains of a 2-decade-long nightmare. He would often run his fingers over the rough edges of the cardboard, feeling the dust that had settled since the 1980s. To anyone else, these were just cold files, but to Tom, they were a collection of voices waiting to be heard. He spent his days in a meticulous sort of patience, organized and unwavering, beneath the hum of fluorescent lights that flickered with a rhythmic, tired pulse. The world outside was rushing into a new millennium, filled with the digital chatter of the internet and the glow of cellular phones. But inside this room, time was frozen in the form of yellowing reports and carefully labeled plastic bags. The evidence lockers held secrets that the technology of the 1980s simply could not unlock. Back then, the tools of forensic science were like blunt instruments trying to perform delicate surgery. But as the seasons turned toward the spring of 2001, a new kind of light began to shine into the microscopic world. Scientists had perfected a technique known as short tandem repeat analysis. It was a process that could take the smallest, most degraded fragments of genetic material and amplify them, turning a faded whisper of a clue into a clear, undeniable shout. Tom Jensen knew that the window of opportunity was finally creaking open. He looked at the evidence gathered from the scenes of Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, and Carol Christensen. These samples had been preserved in cold storage for nearly 20 years, kept away from the dampness and the heat that would have destroyed them. He felt a profound weight as he prepared to send these precious, tiny threads of the past to the state crime lab. He knew they only had one real chance. If the samples were consumed in the testing without yielding a result, the invisible thread connecting the killer to his victims might be severed forever. At the Washington State Crime Lab, the atmosphere was sterile and white, a sharp contrast to the dark, wooded banks where the bodies had once been found. Dr. Beverly Himmick worked with a focused intensity, moving between glass vials and humming centrifuges. The process of polymerase chain reaction was like a biological printing press, taking the ancient, weathered strands of DNA and replicating them over and over until a profile emerged from the void. Outside the lab windows, the gray Seattle rain streaked against the glass, but inside, the focus was entirely on the invisible. They were looking for specific markers, the unique genetic fingerprints that make every human being different from all others. In 1987, the police had collected a sample of saliva from a man named Gary Leon Ridgway, rubbing a piece of gauze against the inside of his cheek. That piece of gauze had sat in a sealed envelope for 14 years, a dry and forgotten relic of a brief encounter. Now, as the machines whirred and the computer screens glowed with complex graphs, that old saliva sample was being brought back into the light to be compared against the evidence from the victims. The moment of revelation did not come with a loud alarm or a flash of light. It came in the form of a quiet alignment on a computer monitor. As the digital sequences flickered and locked into place, the profile from the 1980s evidence matched the profile of Gary Leon Ridgway with a mathematical certainty that was staggering. The odds of it being anyone else were 1 in several trillion. In that instant, the ghost that had haunted the Pacific Northwest for 20 years finally had a face, a name, and a permanent address. When the news reached Tom Jensen, the silence of the evidence room felt different. It was no longer the silence of a mystery, but the heavy, expectant silence of a trap about to close. The man who had spent his days painting trucks at a factory in Renton, living a seemingly mundane and invisible life, was no longer a shadow. The invisible thread had tightened. The science had reached back through 2 decades of grief and confusion to grab hold of the truth. It was a breakthrough that felt like a sudden intake of breath after being underwater for a lifetime. The detectives began to prepare, moving with a renewed and quiet energy, knowing that the man they had talked to so many years ago was finally, undeniably, within their reach. As the month of November in 2001 arrived, the air turned crisp and the trees began to lose their final leaves, leaving the landscape skeletal and bare. The surveillance teams moved into position near the truck plant where Ridgway worked his shifts, day after day, year after year. They watched him through binoculars, seeing a man who looked entirely unremarkable, a man who blended into the gray morning mist like a ghost. He would walk to his vehicle, his movements practiced and slow, unaware that the microscopic world had betrayed him. The weight of the evidence was now a physical presence in the cruisers of the King County Sheriff's Office. On the 30th of November, as the sun hung low and pale in the sky, the order was given. The decades of waiting, the thousands of interviews, and the endless rows of filing cabinets all culminated in a single, quiet moment on a roadside. When the handcuffs finally clicked shut around his wrists, the sound was small, but it echoed across the entire state. The invisible thread had finally pulled the monster out of the darkness and into the unforgiving light of justice. The summer of 2003 arrived in the Pacific Northwest with a deceptive beauty. The sky was a vast, unblemished pane of cerulean blue, and the air carried the sweet, heavy scent of blooming wild roses and warm asphalt. But for the small group of investigators traveling in a nondescript white van, the season held no lightness. Inside the vehicle sat the man who had been a shadow over the valley for more than 20 years. Gary Ridgway, now 54 years old, was no longer the elusive specter of the Green River. He was a guide through a landscape of ghosts. As part of a harrowing plea deal to avoid the death penalty, he had agreed to lead the task force to the places where he had left his victims. They called it the Search for the Lost Souls, a journey into the dark heart of the woods where time seemed to have stood still since 1982. The van moved slowly along the winding shoulder of the Kent Des Moines Road, the tires crunching over gravel and dry summer grass. Outside the windows, the dense wall of Douglas firs and western hemlocks stood like silent sentinels, their deep green needles swallowing the sunlight and casting long, jagged shadows across the forest floor. The process was agonizingly slow, a test of patience and emotional endurance. Ridgway's memory was a fragmented map, eroded by the passage of decades and his own chilling indifference. He would stare out at a ravine or a cluster of blackberry brambles, his brow furrowed as he tried to reconcile the modern landscape with the dark thickets of his past. The investigators watched him closely, the silence inside the van heavy with the unspoken weight of the names they were seeking. When they finally stepped out into the humid air of the woods, the sensory experience was overwhelming. The ground was a springy carpet of emerald moss and decaying cedar mulch, damp even in the heat of July. Every snap of a dry twig under a boot felt like an intrusion into a sacred, terrible space. In August, Near the sun-dappled stretch of State Route 410 in Enumclaw, the searchers found what they had spent a lifetime looking for. Beneath a shallow layer of silt and forest debris, the earth surrendered the remains of 16-year-old Pammy, Annette Avent. The sight of the recovery team working with tiny brushes and hand trowels was a masterclass in reverence. They moved with a rhythmic, quiet grace, peeling back the layers of the earth as if they were carefully waking a sleeping child who had been lost in the shadows for 21 years. As September arrived, bringing with it the first cool whispers of autumn, the search moved toward the rural pockets near the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The atmosphere here was different. The constant, distant roar of jet engines overhead contrasted with the profound, heavy silence of the wooded slopes below. It was here that the woods gave back Marie Malvar and April Buttram, two young women whose families had spent nearly 2 decades trapped in a state of suspended grief. The investigators noted the smell of the sites, a mixture of wet stone, wild ferns, and the metallic tang of the coming rain. Each recovery was a victory of truth over silence, yet each one also reinforced the magnitude of the tragedy. Ridgway spoke of these women with a terrifying lack of emotion, describing his crimes with the same flat, clinical tone one might use to describe painting a truck. He revealed that he had returned to many of these sites, visiting the clusters of remains he had created, a detail that added a layer of profound darkness to the serene forest landscape. The investigators recorded every word, their pens scratching against paper in the humid air, documenting the final chapters of a story that had begun in the blood and mist of the early 80s. On December 18, 2003, the setting shifted from the damp, whispering forests to the sterile, brightly lit confines of the King County Courthouse. The courtroom was a sea of faces, parents who had aged overnight, siblings who had grown up in the shadow of a missing sister, and investigators whose entire careers had been defined by this hunt. The air was stagnant, thick with the collective breath of hundreds of people. Gary Ridgway sat at the defense table, looking small and unremarkable in a dark suit, his thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses giving him the appearance of a mundane clerk. The judge's voice was a steady, rhythmic cadence as he began to read the 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. One by one, the names echoed through the chamber. Wendy Lee Caulfield, Giselle Ann Lovevorn, Deborah Lynn Bonner, Marcia Faye Chapman. Each name was followed by the word guilty, a hammer blow of finality that rang out 48 times. The sentencing was a staggering sum of loss. 48 consecutive life sentences, followed later by a 49th when another set of remains was identified. It was a numerical representation of an infinite debt, a sentence that ensured the man would never again feel the sun on his face outside the walls of a prison. But the most enduring image of that day was not the sentence itself, but a single moment of human grace. Robert Rule, the father of Linda Jane Rule, stood to address the man who had taken his 16-year-old daughter. His voice was a gentle, quivering baritone that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. He spoke of the struggle to live up to his faith, of the turmoil that had held his family in bondage for 20 years. Then he looked directly at Ridgway and said, "Mr. Ridgway, there are people here who hate you. I am not one of them. I forgive you." For the first time, the stone-faced killer broke. Tears welled in his eyes and rolled down his cheeks, a brief, startling display of humanity from a man who had spent decades as a monster. In that moment, the power shifted. The hatred that had acted as a tether between the families and the killer was severed. The courtroom, once heavy with the scent of old paper and suppressed rage, seemed to breathe. The forest of lost souls was finally finding its peace. The names of the women, those found and those still hidden beneath the moss of the lowlands, would no longer be synonymous with a killer, but with the families who loved them and the community that refused to forget them. The valley of the Green River is quiet now. The mist still clings to the riverbanks in the early morning, and the Douglas firs still stand tall over the ravines, but the shadow has retreated. The daughters have been brought into the light, their stories told, their places in the earth marked not by secrets, but by memory and love. The long, cold night of the search has ended, leaving behind a legacy of resilience and the quiet, enduring strength of the human spirit. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.